Forum Borealis Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the North and welcome to a special forum issue called Something Strange This Way Flies. Our guest today is Walter Bosley, who's made some astonishing discoveries connecting such dispersed dots as the origins of modern anti-gravity technology, German nationalist and Nazi occultists, the Breakaway civilization, and elite banksters. He is a genuine researcher in that he follows the track wherever the evidence brings him, rather than seeking to confirm a biased agenda. This is probably in part thanks to his investigative background as an FBI counterintelligence specialist during the Cold War and special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. He's also been a personal security and anti-terrorism consultant for corporate and private clients around the world. In addition, he founded the Lost Continent Library Publishing Company. Apart from being a researcher in historical and occult mysteries, he's also an author of fiction, screenwriter, producer, and a licensed private investigator. See our website for an extensive biography, full bibliography, and filmography. Walt joins us now for a conversation on some remarkable research, as outlined in his book, Friends from Sonora. Welcome to the forum, Walter.
Thank you, Al.
Now, full disclosure here, people. Usually, I read the books of the guests. I have not had a chance to do this with you yet, Walter, because I was just tipped off about you from your friend Joseph Farrell.
Yes.
Yeah, and according to him, you come highly recommended. So I did some frantic research, and the more I find out about your books, the more intrigued I am. Now, I'm usually well oriented about this kind of literature, but somehow you slipped under the radar. But we're going to do something about that today.
Well, I hope so. I look forward to it. And that's probably the case because I think my stuff is a little too new on the scene here in the States in alternative research media. So they're just some of them are just kind of learning about me. It takes a few books to get on the radar over here.
It does, and it also takes a lot of promotion, like interviews and references in media and stuff. So it's a long and windy road, and yet the so-called debunkers have the nerve to dismiss hard research into borderline stuff, as if people are into it for richness and fame.
I don't think any of us are getting rich, right?
No. So, but, well, the few that would earn some money is fully worth it because it's so much painstaking research you guys do. And the book we're going to mainly focus upon today is called Friends from Sonora.
Yes, Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora.
Yes, so it's a part of a series you do called Empire of the Wheel.
Trilogy, yes.
Trilogy. And I have to also to say that's a very Jacques Vallée-ish title.
Oh, thank you. I take that as a compliment.
You should, and it intrigued me. So I'm going to order your book, so next time we have you on in the future, I'm going to be more versed in your material. But you have a good presence online. You have a couple of blogs, isn't that right?
Yes, I have the blog related to my nonfiction writing, which is empireofthewheel.blogspot.com. And then I have a blog relative to the pulp, nostalgic type fiction and entertainment that I like to do in my spare time. The nonfiction blog has been a lot more active in recent years because I've been so busy with that.
Yeah, well, we don't bother too much with the fiction here anyway, because reality is usually stranger than fiction.
It sure is. That's wow.
I guess that's why you jumped over to the other train.
That is the truth. Yeah, I'll tell you.
Okay, let's just get to it then. Something strange this way flies. Before World War II and World War One, too, we had this Zeppelin fad that suddenly went away. It vanished after the Hindenburg. And most people think that the so-called UFO phenomenon started right after the war, or during the war maybe, with the Foo Fighters. But as you've been finding out, that's not so. Could you inform us a little about that situation prior to the war?
Oh, absolutely. There have been, a few writers that have been writing about the Great Airship Mystery of the 1890s and other historical UFO flaps that have gone on, in some cases clear back to ancient times. Mm-hmm. And yet this history, this UFO history prior to World War II still never has seemed to capture a lot of attention in, the alternative media, and certainly really not in the mainstream media. But it's a fascinating precursor to really what happened in World War II. And I decided that, after reading what Jacques Vallée had written about it, what writers like Dennis Crenshaw and Theo Pymans and a gentleman, author named Michael Busby, who's written one of the very best books on the subject. Mm. The deeper I jumped into their work, the more fascinated I became with this interesting little group dating back to California in the 1850s, the decade before our Civil War. And this interesting little group of German immigrants with some Italian rancher friends helping them out were apparently dabbling in what essentially was anti-gravity technology and propulsion and building little flying machines. Now, wow. These were crudely built small machines, made of wood and fabric and, some metal pieces and such. And they were, allegedly a very secretive group. And I thought, wow, what little I knew about them, this is some interesting stuff. And the deeper I dug, the more interesting it became, especially when you consider what happened in the 20th century with, the Germans during World War II and what they were developing, and how that ties in with, what was going on in the post-war UFO scene, so to speak.
Yeah. According to Joseph Farrell, there was official research on these things in the 30s, and people think that's early.
Right.
But could we start with the beginning? You talked about Germans coming to America as a part of, I assume, the general emigration wave.
Yes.
From Europe back then. Now, these people, are any of these well-known?
Well, the well-known, what you would call the more well-known Germans among them, mm-hmm. would be those involved in finance and banking, which that's immediately a buzzword for those familiar with the works of Dr. Farrell, my good friend Joseph. And of course it raised a flag when, they turned up in my research, because I stumbled upon them, not necessarily looking at the mysterious German group in Sonora, California, but when I was looking at an associated lead in my mystery, my Empire of the Wheel mystery, that involved a historical Western figure, and how these German bankers, in particular, were connected to the railroad, which was associated with these historical figures. But what happened was, I looked at the era that they came to the United States and what they were involved in. And then I looked at this mysterious group of German immigrants in California building these flying machines, and I began to notice little threads, linking the two. And I realized, okay, I think what I've got here is the backers, the individuals that were involved with this mysterious group called NYMZA, which, according to our original source on these German immigrants who were building flying machines in California in the 1850s, that man was named Charles Dellschau. He himself was a German immigrant. He's the one that brought the word NYMZA onto this scene. And I realized that what I thought I had was these German bankers were the money men, the material resource men behind the mysterious group NYMZA, which sponsored the Germans building the flying machines in California. Have I confused you yet?
Yeah, well, it sounds like a lot of facts at the same time. Let's start chronologically here.
Okay.
Just for listeners who are maybe not so familiar with the history of science, I have to point out that most people think 1850 to 1900 was a very primitive era, but actually, if you look into it, from 1850 to the Second World War, there was much more going on in science in the world. It's like science was free. There was many discoveries going on. There was different, I would call, directions of science than you see today. Especially all this about vibrations, electromagnetism. It's actually much older than people think. And of course, everybody has heard about Tesla, but he wasn't born in a vacuum. So, but still, 1850, how do we know that there were, for a lack of a better term, UFO sightings in California that early?
Well, we know that in the 1890s, a lot of the mystery airship sightings were taking place in California, particularly up in San Francisco and Sacramento. However, the group in California in the 1850s, when you look at the research that's been done on the names associated with that group, you find an individual named Solomon Andrews. Now, there is a newspaper report on this in the middle of the Civil War, the American Civil War, on how Dr. Andrews demonstrated a flying machine to Abraham Lincoln's War Department representatives during the Civil War, and how the Secretary of War back then, Edwin Stanton, had expressed little to no interest in spite of an apparently very impressive demonstration. Now, there were no UFO sightings as such reported in California in the 1850s. And this particular group, which called itself the Sonora Aeroclub, they were very secretive and controlling about when they would take their machines out and fly them. So they successfully managed to avoid, being seen by enough of the public, if anybody saw them, for reports to get out there. Now we're talking, specific to what was going on in the U.S. back then. But it wasn't too long after that, we're talking just 30 years later or so, that we had these massive airship sightings. And this predated the era that you mentioned before of the Zeppelins and such. This was in an era, when people were not used to seeing these kinds of things in the sky. And it's important to note that the descriptions of these airships were much different than what would, be developed in known history, such as the Zeppelins and the blimps and other things like that. So this.
So what did they look like then?
Well, they did have, many of them, the long cigar shape, the Zeppelin type of looking shape. But what was interesting is that they had these powerful lights on them. they moved at incredible speeds sometimes compared to Zeppelins. They seem to work with an electromagnetic power. It seemed like the noises that they're described making, or even the silence. That was the other aspect, really the silence of them, or the music. Now, I have not delve too deeply into this particular aspect, but it's very important to mention that musical sound and tone is involved in reports of this phenomenon, to the point where other researchers and writers have suggested, is there something going on technologically with these airships and music, or the use of sound? So these things, even though at a glance you'd say, oh, it's an airship, it's a Zeppelin, or it's a blimp. Actually, when you look at the details of the report, these things were not your traditional air-filled or gas-filled dirigibles. These were not dirigibles as we know them.
No, they remind much more of traits connected to more contemporary UFO reports, especially the silence and the strong lights and the quick speed, and
the elegance. What's interesting is, you're right, with the reports of the technology, with how they move, they're much more like the modern UFO reports. But what's interesting is their physical description was a more decorative, elegant object, which, when you think about it, reflects the times. If your listeners, they're familiar with steampunk culture, just imagine you take a modern UFO and you do it up like a steampunk craft, and there you go. That's what these mystery airships were like, particularly the ones in the 1850s.
Right. You know what? Let's just continue to talk about the phenomena before we delve into who's behind it, and
okay,
because most people won't even know about this phenomena.
Sure.
So I think it's better we do this. So already back in you said 1890s, or was there sightings all the way back to 50s?
Well, anytime you dig into things, you can find interesting, mentions of this or that. But for the most part, in taking a simple look at it, the major phenomenon occurred in the 1890s. And in my work, I believe I have shown the connection between what was going on with these guys in California in the 1850s and the subsequent, more famous 1890s airship mystery.
Right. So we can say that in the 1890s it became very prominent, this phenomenon, in people's...
yes.
It reached the newspapers much more.
Oh, many newspapers. There were witnesses in the hundreds and thousands, because these things were seen over cities across the United States, mostly in the Midwest and the West.
Interesting. Obviously, they did not refer to it as UFOs or flying saucers. What was the term for it in the popular media?
They called them airships. They called them airships, skyships, because that's, back then, there were ships crossed the sea, and these things sailed the skies, so to speak.
Well, we still say spaceships. So
yes,
I guess
exactly.
It's logical. So, yeah, it's a better word.
Yeah, these were airships and skyships. Now, the guys in the 1850s, when they called themselves the Sonora Aeroclub, that's AERO, as in aeroplane, the aeronautical term, aero. But in the 1890s, it was the mystery airship, is what the papers referred to them as. Right.
There was sightings all the way up here in Scandinavia too, I understand.
Well, I'm not sure about during the 1890s. Those I don't know about. My research pretty much focused on what happened in North America and a touch of South America. Because of the people I was dealing with, their trail pretty much went from North America to South America. But there were, of course, as you know, the mystery rocket sightings during the 1930s, before World War II broke out.
And that's still a little early on the timeline. You said 1819. Officially, this first plane was launched when? 1905?
Three. I think it was, well, Kitty Hawk was 1903. But, as we know, there were attempts before 1903. There was even a man whose name escapes me. I apologize. But he was doing tests of flying machines in more traditional airplane type of stuff in California before 1903. I just cannot think of his name. His story has made it into the media a little bit in recent years, and there was actually, I believe, a movie made about him back in the 40s or 50s. Interestingly enough. But his name escapes me. But he it's worth mentioning because it predated. It was literally like a rowboat with wings. It was very quaint.
So already in 1890 there were attempts around. There were aeroclubs around.
Yeah.
So people wouldn't be too shocked. Most people would have heard about this.
And then there's the legend in 1908. I should say the legend about the 1908 Tesla ship that allegedly, now this is a legend, there's a story out there that Tesla designed this ship, was part of the building of it, and it went to Mars and back. But that's another story.
Wow.
That's another story.
Well, yeah. Stories are often, you can base research on stories, but they can be circumstantial evidence.
Sure, yeah.
So, so we know that there was people trying to get stuff done at the end of the 19th century, and officially they got stuff done right at the turn of the century. It's not a big leap, I think, to imagine then that there were also undercover stuff going on. But how did you tie these Germans to these 1819 sightings?
Well, it all starts with going back to the Sonora Aero Club and those German immigrants that went to this small town west of Yosemite National Park in California called Sonora. And they based their flying club, their aero club there in Sonora. And a gentleman named Charles Dellschau, who emigrated to the United States in the 1850s, he was the first guy to write about this Sonora Aero Club and the mysterious organization called NYMZA. Now, Dellschau, in his journals, he describes NYMZA as an organization based in Germany. It's headquartered in Germany, and it supported and backed several of these flying clubs. The one in California apparently was not the only one. Now, he also goes on to talk about how he was sent to California on behalf of NYMZA. He was a representative of NYMZA who came out to California to meet with this Sonora Aero Club and these German immigrants to see their progress. And he was supposed to report back to the NYMZA in Germany. So there's also associated with this mysterious group NYMZA certain players in the 1890 airship mystery. Okay? So I'm looking at this. I'm saying, well, the original source on NYMZA says that it was around in the 1850s and it was backing these small flying clubs, and this organization was based in Germany, right? And then we have the 1890s airship mystery, in which NYMZA, this secret organization, is identified with bankers. So I'm thinking, okay, I've got the 1850s group backed by the mysterious NYMZA, the 1890s mystery, which involves the mysterious NYMZA and bankers that are making all this happen. And, I thought to myself, okay, how does this possibly tie together? And I set that aside to pull a thread and investigate another aspect of my book. And in that, I discovered that backers of American railroads in the middle 19th century happened to be these German bankers who came to the Midwest, the Kuhn brothers. Okay, now they were such successful bankers and so successful with the railroads that they became essentially the owners of more railroad miles than any other person or company in the U.S. They became very powerful and very wealthy. And they, of course, were from Germany. Now, Kuhn teamed up with Loeb. You had Kuhn Loeb. Kuhn Loeb owned the Union Pacific Railroad, which was a major railroad then, and that ties into my research. The Union Pacific Railroad does, and so there I had these German bankers in the Midwest tied to the railroads, and I discovered another thing. I discovered that the airship sightings happen to follow closely where the railroad lines are.
Huh.
And I thought, well, I wonder if there's a connection here further. So I'm digging a little deeper into this completely other aspect that led me to the whole railroad connection and the German banker connection. And that thread led down to South America. Okay.
I just have to interject. I love the way you work. It takes an FBI guy to nest up this thread. Continue.
Well, a lot of it is, an investigator's intuition. And what you do is you pull threads. You know this. You pull threads, you find things, you set them aside, and then you keep digging. And then if you find something that resonates with what you've already found, then you go back to that. And then, this is how these things pop up. But you always, of course, as you indicated before, you always need the hard material evidence if you can find it before you really put this stuff out there. And that's what I was finding was more material evidence. Now, what's interesting about this leading to South America was it brought up the whole issue, of course, of gold mining. And I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, Dellschau in the 1850s is saying that NYMZA is a German organization. I have this, this German banking group involved with, the power of the American railroads. And then I have the 1890s airship mystery, which happens to be, seen, along areas where there's a railroad going on. And this is leading me to South America, where there's a lot of gold mining, right? So I'm looking at the era and I asked myself, okay, what was going on in history, and particularly with the Germans during the 1890s and the early 1900s?
Good question.
And sure enough, it was the gold standard. Europe and the U.S., they were all on the gold standard for currency, right? And it just so happens that when I looked into the history of mining in South America, that it was in the 19th century that the real serious German interest in South America began. Now we know the whole thing about in the 20th century and the whole Nazi connection to South America. Well, what I discovered, I believe, was the origins of the German material interest in South America and what led to what became the Nazi hideouts after the war in the 20th century.
Wow.
All of this was filling in these gaps. And there were these German bankers. So then I realized, wait a minute, I think I might be able to identify this mysterious organization NYMZA, which, because of the way the word was spelled, it's an acronym. It's all capital letters. NYMZA, NYMZA. It was assumed because of during the 1890s the New York connection to the airship mystery. It has always been assumed that NYMZA, NYMZA, was an acronym for a New York-based organization, and it's easy to understand why people assume that because of the NY, right? But I thought, you know what? There's something not right about this because going back to the 1850s, Dellschau himself said NYMZA is based in Germany. It is a German organization, and you had these German immigrants making the most progress on these flying machines in California. There's your German connection there. And then you have these powerful German bankers with their connections to banking in Germany now, in the United States, building a power base through the railroads. And then you have, what was going on with the gold standard in Germany again, this was, as you know, in the 19th century, there was the whole unification process of how the Prussian states became Germany, a unified Germany, all that going on. And that's in the mix. So I realized, wait a minute, it makes no sense that NYMZA, with all this I've just said, that NYMZA is a New York-based organization. We know, that the word NYMZA means New York or is anything in English. It didn't make sense to me. It made more sense to me that NYMZA, this word, had to have a German translation. So I sat down, looked at the acronym, and I just decided I need to break this down. And each one of these letters, is there anything in the German language that these letters would represent? And I was astonished. Now, do not ask me to recite to you what the actual, because I always mispronounce it in the German. Okay. But what happened was I discovered that there indeed is a German word for every letter in NYMZA that would apply and make logical sense. And when I did, the first person I threw this at was Joseph Farrell, and he threw it past some trusted native German speakers, and they came back and said, this is very good. The only recommended change was whether to use the Y or go ahead and switch to the J, which is more appropriate in proper German pronunciation. And so that's why in my German translation of NYMZA, the way I say it's supposed to be spelt is NJMZ with a lowercase a. Now, I explain in that book and even a little bit further in Empire of the Wheel 3 why Dellschau would have written this as NYMZA, which he does in his material. And that's due to what is called transliteration. In other words, he was writing in English, right, for an potential English audience reading his journal. And so he wanted to make sure that they pronounced the acronym properly. So I ended up coming up with the literal translation into English is the Nationalist Hunting Pursuit Airship Finance or Production Office. Okay. Yeah. However, I think, basically it was the Nationalist Airship Unit or something, how we would say in English parlance here. Mm-hmm. Now, the very important, most important distinction here, of course, is nationalist, not national, because in German/Prussian politics going on at the time, we know that when you look at that, the nationalists were coming from a distinct perspective, a distinct point of view, and this was not a government, any kind of government agency, this NYMZA. It was a private organization that were nationalists. They were German nationalists.
If people don't know it, nationalism was on the rise at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th.
Right. And not only were there, here's the interesting thing on top of this, not only do I identify individuals involved from German banking in the 19th into the 20th centuries that were probably the players in the NYMZA. There were also hermeticists, occultists, German occultists in the mix. Now, as I argue in the book, and I think Joseph agrees with generally, and one of the reasons why he liked the book so much was basically these guys I'm talking about are the ones who created the environment from which the Nazi occultists grew in the early 20th century, sprung from. This is why what I found is important, because this is the milieu from which those guys sprang, and from which the development they advanced of this same technology. Here's the thing. The 1890s airship mystery, and also specifically the technology used in the 1850s by the Sonora Aeroclub, you can look at the drawings that Dellschau did, and you can see the propulsion device. It is exactly the same technological concept that Joseph Farrell and Igor Wachowski have written about the Bell. It is essentially Bell technology that was being used in the 1850s in Sonora, California. It's astonishing. When you look at Dellschau's illustrations, I recommend a book put out by a gentleman, Stephen Romano. He owns an art gallery, and he's a publisher in New York, and he has published an amazing volume of a huge collection of Dellschau's works of these airships. And between that book, which shows these airships, these arrows, from the 1850s in full color schematics, between that and Dennis Crenshaw's book, The Secrets of Dellschau, you can see these devices that are exactly the Bell. You've got the rotation, you've even got the Bell shape in some instances. It's astonishing.
Right. 2 points then. First, we can then safely assume that the Bell did not rise in a vacuum, and in fact, these people have had a lifetime of research before getting to the Bell, which means that the Bell must have had more advanced intentions. Granted that your case is genuine here, then it must have been a more advanced aspect to the Bell than just making it levitate.
Right.
Now, the second thing is, Mr. Dellschau, if he was indeed connected to this, he was, but if this semi-secret NYMZA interest group tried to stay under the radar, how come Mr. Dellschau was publishing and big-mouthing all about this then, back then?
Here's the beauty. He wasn't. These were all private journals. Right. This was all a private journal, with the artwork was in his private collection. And when he died, get this, these works ended up on a trash pile. And a man who owned a junk store, he found them, and he kept them. And another gentleman, Pete Navarro, he was the first to tell the story publicly about Dellschau back in the 1980s, early 1980s. And so Dellschau's story in the NYMZA, this was all a secret. He died, I can't remember, I don't have the year in front of me. He died in the early 20th century, and this stuff would have been lost if the junk dealer had not found it. And if Pete Navarro had not bought it from the junk dealer and pursued an investigation of who was this Dellschau, who were these German immigrants in California doing this. So actually Dellschau was not intending to spill the beans, as it were, publicly. That came later. That came decades later.
So the connection between NYMZA and the airship mystery is dots that have been connected at a later time. This is not something that has been known these 150 years.
Well, we didn't know anything about what was going on in Sonora, California with this Sonora Aeroclub and Dellschau until these journals were found by the junk dealer.
When were they found, by the way?
I believe it was the early 70s, 71, 72, something like that. And a lot of, pretty much everything we know about the Sonora Aeroclub originated from these journals by Dellschau, and any kind of subsequent research that anyone's done in Sonora. I went there last year myself, and I found several leads that I'm still following up on, and I'll write about those and publish those if I find anything substantial. But it would prove that certain people were there at the time, or it would serve to prove that. But it has been just a big mystery, that's been out there. And then the other guys, Sean Castile, Theo Pymans, and greatly Michael Busby, these three really dug into this. Michael Busby especially digging into the 1890s airship mystery. And he showed some of the first connections that probably linked Sonora Aeroclub to this 1890s milieu. And what I've done is I've filled in the blank. My translation of NYMZA is the first of its kind. The only other translation out there was just a guess, a speculation, the New York Motor Zephyr Association, which was a noble try, but it totally ignores what Dellschau, the source, says about NYMZA. So, yeah, we are dealing with, in all honesty, the Sonora Aero Club and the NYMZA, they're just now beginning to really get on the radar and begin to have their due. I'm still one of the first writers on this, and there were, these guys before me, Crenshaw, Busby.
Yeah, does NYMZA pop up in references anywhere else except for this? Do we know?
No. Dellschau is the source on NYMZA, and to the extent of what Theo Pymans and Jacques Vallée and Michael Busby talk about in regard to the 1890s material. NYMZA is mentioned in the John Worrell Keely. There's an interesting figure there for you, Keely. Of the 1890s, NYMZA, I think, is sometimes linked to, what he was doing.
What was he doing?
He was involved in Schauberger type of, stuff that. Let me rephrase that. Mm-hmm. The kind of things Schauberger was doing, and what is believed was used by Edward Leedskounen when he built Coral Castle. In other words. Yeah. Anti-gravity type stuff. Keely was in the late 19th century. He was a contemporary of Tesla. Tesla never met him, interestingly enough, but he was in New York there. He was the darling of American spiritualists and occultists during his lifetime, his time of notoriety. And again, here we have these occultists popping up, with involvement. Going back to where the Bell technology came from, really it goes back to very, very ancient times with the Hindu Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the stories of the Vimanas, because the Mercury vortex engine, so to speak. And these occultists, they would have been very much aware of these kinds of ancient scriptures and these flying machines, these Vimanas. And so this is likely where this knowledge came from. So it should be no surprise that we have occultists and hermeticists and such in the mix here.
Mm-hmm. It's logical we wouldn't find references to NYMZA because, as you yourself said, it's an Americanization of a club that already is private. So the big question then is if they had, and by the way, in esoteric and hermetic circles, it's been a custom among the genuinely private ones, not those who pride themselves on being it just to get members,
right.
But those who try to stay under the radar, it's been custom for them not only to have different names and labels depending on the region they're operating in.
Sure.
Like to say they have a chapter in London and a chapter in Hamburg, they would have different names. But in addition, many have also changed names in time, not only in space, but in time, during history, external transformation, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But if we assume that you have, if you manage to track up this German version of the NYMZA reference, have you been able to find any references to that outside of Mr. Dellschau's published material?
Not as such. I have not specifically pursued it because I got on the trail of other things. And however, in Empire of the Wheel 3, the nameless ones, I do some. I provide some more analysis of the word NYMZA and how actually it is hieroglyphic in the sense that even though I have discovered a German translation for it, that the NYMZA version that Dellschau uses could still have actually been used. In other words, double meanings.
Also very common among esoteric circles. Very common.
Yes, exactly. And I go into that and explain other references to NYMZA that might actually exist in ancient Egyptian times. And that's in Empire of the Wheel 3, the nameless ones, that I provide that.
Right. I think you should check it up, because if there is separate traces out there that's not connected to the American flight, there may be a gold mine of information waiting.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm not done with the NYMZA research. You see, even the book I'm finishing up, I'm in the middle of, I should say, now, and it's a follow-up to my book titled Secret Missions from last year. My Secret Missions books and my Empire of the Wheel books, I'm writing on the same general milieu that I have jumped into. It's just a different aspect. So there are things in my first Secret Missions book which refer to some of this material from the Empire of the Wheel books. And there are things in the current Secret Missions 2 book that I'm writing that definitely directly refer to what's in the first Secret Missions book and in the book we're talking about today, Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora. So I'm still dealing with this milieu. I'm just describing different parts of it. All my books kind of tie together in one way or another.
Right. So hopefully we'll get to see the whole elephant eventually.
Hopefully. if I can describe it, I mean, I could spend the rest of my life, I think, writing about this thing and not get the whole picture. Who knows?
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
Is it your impression that those who called the shots were stationed in Germany?
Yes. Either Frankfurt or Munich.
Frankfurt, you say? Interesting.
Or Munich, yeah.
Or Munich.
Or Berlin, I'm sorry, Berlin.
Not Munich.
Berlin, I think, is what my information was indicating, Frankfurt or Berlin. But that's just my best speculation at the time based on, a thread that I pulled.
Well, I could add to that then, that Frankfurt is one of the places in Germany which have proved esoteric lineages back to the 18th and 17th centuries, Hermetic stuff.
Yes.
The problem is that the Nazis were obsessed by killing off every other occult and esoteric manifestation out there. So they turned what was a mecca for occultism before they took over to a ruin after the war. So that most traces were gone, most people were killed off, most paper were either destroyed or taken by the SS, and this is probably also one obstacle for you then when it comes to finding German references. However, back then there was very good connections between Austria, Switzerland and southern Germany, so Switzerland especially may have stuff that has survived.
Well, that's very interesting that you say that, because in my new book, which I'll keep a secret until it's ready to be released, Switzerland and some of these other places you're just talking about, that milieu from that point of view, the occultists and such, has popped up in my current book that I'm writing. So I don't know. I might have to pick your brain at another time to get some good leads, because you're touching right on some of the places my threads are leading to in the current book.
Yeah, we can take that in private. But back to your mystery here. So we take it then that there's a powerful group. The exil Germans are still connected, of course, to their friends at home. And do we have any indication that the people at home in Europe were experimenting with something similar?
Well, I didn't look deeply at that. It didn't pop up to the extent that I was researching, but I believe in general there was a lot of research going on in I believe that was the early aviation period, at least the 1890s we're talking about, which, my understanding is France and Germany were really, really at the forefront of that in Europe at that time. So, if they were doing something more secret, which I'm sure somebody was, as yet I haven't delved into that.
No, but like Joseph said the other day, there were sightings in Scandinavia. Now imagine you're a part of this wealthy German group and you want to test out your latest models.
Sure.
Now Germany is very populated, even back then. They couldn't go far until being spotted. And I guess the Alps, maybe that's too risky. So I think sending them off up to Scandinavia wouldn't be a bad choice, because back then the Scandinavian aero fleet was pretty primitive.
Sure.
And they couldn't defend their own airspace very effectively. So I think that could. I'm just speculating here, obviously. But
it makes perfect sense if there were sightings during this era of 1890s, early 20th century. I would say NYMZA had a hand in it. Yeah, I will say that if we're talking about these mystery type airships, or what we would call UFOs today, if you're talking in the late 19th century, definitely this was NYMZA's hand in this, over in Scandinavia and anywhere.
Well, I think it's a bit later, but I wouldn't see them go away if they succeeded.
Oh, they didn't. I don't think they've gone away. I explain that in the book, of course. I don't think they went away at all. As a matter of fact, what I argue is that the American faction, there was an American faction of American industrialists who likely broke off sometime after Solomon Andrews made that demonstration to Abraham Lincoln's cabinet of the flying machine. I think sometime in the 1870s, American associates of this NYMZA research, I think they broke away and established their own thing, which I refer in my book to this division as Team NYMZA and Team Sonora, because the book goes into this in greater detail, but in a nutshell, essentially, I think the guys in Sonora, the German immigrants and the other, the guys involved in that, I think they liked being so far away from the home office, so to speak. I think they liked their independence and autonomy, and I think they eventually got involved with the American backers, who were probably from New York and the Northeast United States. And this was the early stages of this American faction that I simply refer to as Team Sonora. So I think that by the 1890s, you had two secretive groups that were behind these mystery airships. And the airship mystery that was going on in North America, I think these were airships being built by the secret American group, which I call Team Sonora. And I think that this Team Sonora and their rivals, Team NYMZA, the older Team NYMZA, I think that they are what we call the breakaway civilizations.
That was my next question to you. And have you been in communication with Richard Dolan?
I met Richard Dolan for the first time at the Secret Space Program Breakaway Civilization Conference last summer in San Mateo that Joseph Farrell spoke at. And he requested a copy of my book. And so I've met him. I, of course, saw his talk there, his and Joseph's and everybody else's. And yeah, I think definitely when we're talking breakaway civilizations today, I think we're talking really about the secretive NYMZA of the 19th century and this other American group. I think these are the two rival breakaway civilizations that have been operating throughout the 20th century and who are operating now.
This has to be the cradle for that. But the interesting thing then is that, and probably maybe you're touching upon this, but if there are two rival factions, and that makes completely sense, because first of all, when they do emigrate, they are not that much in touch with the others. And when you are working on something, it's just psychology. When you're working on something exceptional, classified, you would want to keep it as tight as possible. And
Right.
maybe there are also philosophical differences, because when the nationalism took off in Europe,
Yeah.
obviously exiles, they can be proud and all that, but the American national feeling was also present, especially back then.
Yeah. When I refer to the American-based one, I'm speaking geographically, because I think it might have started out with American industrialists developing this, but of course, over the last 100 and some years, geographically, it would be maybe headquartered in the States, but who knows who makes up now in the international community, who that is.
Probably on another planet.
Yeah, exactly. And you brought up a good point, the philosophical differences. I believe that was the root of the split to begin with in the 1870s. I think the split was the guys in America, due to the where we were back then, philosophically, I think that the group that broke off, the German NYMZA, you had the powerful money guys, but you also had deep roots into the Hermetic, the occult philosophy was still very much involved in what the NYMZA did. And I think these guys who broke off, they were the more, they saw themselves as the more practical. They just wanted to advance this technology and use it for commerce and to explore, and they were the more nuts and bolts guys. They had a different philosophy. I think this is where I'm coming from on this, and they weren't so steeped in occult interests. They were the more practical, gadgets guys who just wanted to advance a technology and exploit it for commercial purposes or whatever. And I think that is your philosophical break between these two civilizations. I think one is much more hermetic minded than the other, and who knows if either one of them has our best interests in mind.
And intentions are no guarantees anyway. So
exactly. I think they got great stuff. We're screwed.
We're already deep into speculation area,
Sure.
But we can substantiate this. If we assume then that the European or the German faction, geographically speaking, were tied up to nationalist milieus, we may see one of the hands behind the Nazis. On the other hand, the Nazis did go out and swipe clean not only Germany but the whole area of influence for secret societies, for secret research, exotic research. So the big question is, did the Nazis hijack NYMZA? Or did NYMZA manage to play a part behind the scene of the Nazis? Because then we can see how the conflict was evolved during the Second World War. Yeah.
My position is there would have been no Nazis without the NYMZA.
Elaborate, please.
When you're speaking materially, I think they were behind whatever material resources the Nazi scientists and engineers needed. Going back to the 1920s, really, late 1920s and into the 1930s, I think they were the ones behind the direction that the Nazi engineers and scientists took their development. I think, they were definitely, they had a hand, NYMZA had a hand in the direction the Nazis went. I think they probably provided or directed them to material resources. I also argue, because it's in my book in detail, that really when the Nazis got into South America, and particularly when, the survivors fled and holed up in South America, this was NYMZA real estate. And Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora, goes into that. It explains how that happened and how it's connected. Basically, the NYMZA owned all that real estate that subsequently the Nazis were found hiding in,
Patagonia,
including yes, Bariloche and any of the other places.
Yeah.
I point out how this was first established. These places were the ownership was first established in connection with Germany through the NYMZA and their activities. So I like to say that when you're speaking the occult philosophy and when you're speaking the scientific development and exploration that the Nazis were doing, you wouldn't have had any of that without NYMZA first. I definitely think NYMZA and its milieu, its people, were a direct and active influence on the development of the Nazi milieu.
According to Peter Levenda, who's like you, he's a field researcher.
Yes, excellent.
Yeah, according to him, the Nazis started to invest in these areas already in the 20s and the 30s, especially the 30s when they got the power. And obviously powerful German families were connected from the 19th centuries because Argentina especially, but many of these South American countries, like you point out, had a heavy German establishment. Only in Argentina there's, I think it's 4 million Germans or Germanic people. So if the Nazis already invested in these places during the 30s for business purposes, but as the war started and things went sour, also for a rat line purpose.
Yes.
So then it starts to make sense that because the rat lines were all over the world, but why so heavy in South America? Because, as you point out, the NYMZA people were already established there.
Exactly, because the whole Prussian structure and then the early, unified Germany, it started because not just for the gold. I mean, they needed gold for that gold standard that Wilhelm, embraced and put them on. But you see, they were also taking a look at the lost the forgotten technology of the lost civilization down in South America. And that's another aspect that my work goes into. And my current book, I'm deeply in that right now in my current book.
So now you're referring to the Native American lore?
Well, yeah, it has nothing to do with the, even in the Inca history, you go back far enough. Remember, they told the Spanish at the time of the conquest that they had no idea who built some of these places, like, Tiahuanaco and Cuzco. And it was a mystery to them. So we're talking a civilization that predates the Native American civilizations of North and South America.
And we do know the Nazis were obsessed with expeditions to verify the antediluvian reality.
Yes.
We've touched upon that in several shows already.
Sure.
Now, according to both Levenda, Farrell, and other researchers, the Nazis were very much tied up in certain corporations. And Farrell mentioned on a forum we had with him called Secrets of the Third Reich that already in the 30s there was experiments with bell technology within, I think it was Siemens, one of these major corporations.
Yes.
And also some kind of electrical company, I forgot the name. Have you checked into these leads?
No, because that's the 20th century stuff. That is so well covered by Joseph and others, and my threads I'm pulling are all at the moment 19th century. So I'm filling in the background, as Joseph has told me.
It is virgin territory compared to most else out there. That's so great. Somebody has to do it.
Well, I'll tell you, one thing leads to another, and when you get deeper into Friends from Sonora, it's going to blow you away what led me there, because I'm not going to give too much away, but I'm sure you've heard of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Yeah,
okay.
I had one question about them, but I must admit the extent of my knowledge is due to Paul Newman and Robert Redford.
Oh, okay.
And a little Vicky glance.
Yeah.
It is a start, but up until yesterday, actually. I always regarded that as a very American culture-ish thing.
Sure.
Now it's dawning upon me that this is deeper. You want to say something about that?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. When I pulled a particular thread, an unexpected bit of information came up when I say unexpected, I emphasize that. I had no idea that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would pop up in this stuff I was investigating about. I mean, it just blew me away. And then as I pulled threads, what astonished me was how their story connects to the German bankers that are associated with NYMZA. And when you read the book, I don't want to give away, but I pretty much redefine what their whole purpose for going to South America really was. And when you read the book, you'll see a different point of view, based on the facts of the whole Butch Cassidy story. And it'll astonish you probably as much as it does me. But I think that I present enough solid material evidence that the speculation is valid. Let's put it that way. It is a speculation, but I think the speculation is a lot more valid once you read the book than it seems, when I just say, hey, Butch Cassidy's involved in this, people go, what are you talking about? That's crazy. Yeah. And then when they look at it and they actually read the book, they come away convinced, oh, okay, there's something to this. And you'll see as you get deeper into it, you'll see. And they are directly, I'm convinced, I present it in the book, they are directly involved with some of these real estate acquisitions the Germans made that ended up being in the hands of the Nazis, ended up being hideouts for the Nazis, believe it or not. It's in the book, and you'll see how I tie it together.
Right. In your book, since I haven't read it, when you outline these things, are you good at footnotes and references and stuff like that? How is it styled?
I hope so. I hope I'm good at it. I hope I'm good enough.
Not everybody bothers too much, but are you very specific where you're speculating and...
Yes. It's funny that you'd mention that, because I usually put my notes and source material in the back of the book. And Joseph Farrell, specifically, when he read this one, he's the one that recommended to him. He said, look, take some time to do traditional footnotes where they're right there at the bottom of the page. And so I went back, I took 2 weeks, and I went through the whole book, and I took all my footnote stuff, and you'll see it's footnoted right there. Like, instead of, you don't have to go to the back of the book or the end of the chapter. It's all right there on the page. And yes, it's actually a very footnoted book. This isn't, I tried my best to be able to present these actual legitimate sources where this stuff comes from and what I'm basing my speculations upon, because it's a good point. It's very important. You can write something and not provide any footnotes, and it doesn't help the argument. But this was so astonishing to me that I felt it was very important to footnote this in a way I had not done any previous books.
Yeah, and especially regarding you're coming from fiction, so you got the pain now.
Yeah, that kind of throws people off, because they think, oh my God, he's a fiction writer, so how much of this nonfiction is he making up? But I like to remind them, hey, I was a Boy Scout. I was I was in a profession where I had to be trusted, so right. I'm an honest guy. I'm trying to do it right.
But how did this transition go from fiction to research?
From fiction to the nonfiction?
Yeah.
Well, my first nonfiction book was my Disneyland book, Latitude 33, Key to the Kingdom. And that was the result of having a conversation with a friend of mine who has a podcast, and he's an author. And we were talking about weird stuff related to Disneyland, and And I looked into it a little bit, and the more I looked, the more weird and interesting it became. But basically, the subject had come up to begin with because I had had a personal, very strange experience at Disneyland in the early 1980s, and some strange synchronicities and other things had continued after that experience over the years. And all these things together, I just decided, well, there's that weird experience I had. There's all this other strange stuff involved with the history of Disneyland and the symbolism in the park. I just decided, you know what, I'm going to write a book about this. And so that book, Latitude 33, became my first nonfiction book. Well, while I was putting that book together and in the process of publishing it, some other strange things happened personally, and which I started investigating and was actually investigating for a year and a half, I think almost 2 years before I decided to write about it. So to answer your question directly, the nonfiction really came out of personal experiences that I just felt compelled to write about. And, I found that it's hard to stop once you get started.
Did you do the fiction as a cloaked way to communicate your research? Obviously, I don't know about your fiction. That's why I'm asking.
Only one work of fiction, you could say, is that. And basically, it was a time travel horror fantasy type novel that I wrote at the same time that I wrote Empire of the Wheel 1, the first Empire of the Wheel book. I wrote it at the same time, and basically I put concepts and ideas, speculations in that novel that I did not want to put into the nonfiction book.
I see.
And I'm glad that I separated them, because the direction that the nonfiction book goes is more material and evidence-based, and is a different animal. But in the direction the novel goes is very entertaining. People love it. They think it should be a movie. But yeah, there were certain ideas that popped up, and I said, well, that's better for the novel, and I just set them aside until I was mostly done with the nonfiction book, and then went back to the novel and put it out there. But other than that, I basically, my recent fiction is just me taking a break from the nonfiction and having fun with writing pulp. So,
but I think people don't realize that it's actually an advantage, because if you're trained in being a good storyteller, it's an advantage when you delve into research. Then we can expect that not only is the stuff you're presenting solid, due to references and research, but also presented in a way which we will appreciate, because things can be presented in many ways. So this just adds to the quality of your books. What little I read from you already online suggests that you're a very well written guy. So
I hope so.
Yeah, so I think people should check you out. Now, before we wrap this up, I have a couple of related questions to the book again. First, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, do they have any German connections themselves?
Well, personally, Harry Longabaugh, also known as the Sundance Kid, he was born and raised in Pennsylvania. And I don't know if you know much of the history of different states here in the U.S.
Yes, German Hermetic immigrants came to Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah, you're...
Johannes Kerpius.
I'm not kidding you, Al. I was just writing about German hermeticists emigrating to Pennsylvania about an hour before we started this interview.
Can I recommend then a prime source for you?
Sure, absolutely.
You maybe know it, but it's a book by a guy called Julius Saxe.
Okay.
You don't know it? Excellent.
No.
Okay,
no.
This will be good for you. It's the first serious take. I think the book came out in the 1890s, around there. It's one of the first serious takes on the German immigrants to Pennsylvania.
Oh, very good.
Which were esoteric connected.
Yes.
And I think the book is called German pietists and Rosicrucians in Pennsylvania, something like
German pietists, yes, that was specifically. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. This is exactly what I was reading about today. So
yeah, but this is a primary source. Everybody else
Excellent.
copies this.
Okay.
So you were saying then that he was born and raised there, Mr.
Yes, in Western Pennsylvania, and he's an interesting guy himself. And the other German connection is this, in that the German bankers owned the Union Pacific Railroad, or had backed. I'm sorry, they had backed, provided the loans, provided the resources for E.H. Harriman to purchase the Union Pacific Railroad. And if you remember your Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid movie, they were always robbing the trains of E.H. Harriman, the Union Pacific Railroad. Well, I discovered something real interesting about Butch and E.H. Harriman, which was very interesting in light of the fact, and you'll read about it in the book, very interesting in light of the fact that I had not known that these German bankers were actually the men who backed E.H. Harriman. And I argue that it's the German bankers connected to NYMZA who wanted Harriman to send Butch and Sundance and their friend Etta Place, who is actually even more important in my investigation than Butch and Sundance are, but I don't want to spoil that for you.
That's the woman they hang with, right?
That's the woman, yeah. She's very important in all of this. They went to South America, sent there by E.H. Harriman, on behalf of the German bankers of NYMZA. And that's all I'll tell you.
Cool.
I'll let you read it.
Sure,
So.
yeah, don't ruin the pleasure. But my first question then, as an investigator, would be, if these trains were owned by Harriman, who was his worst competition?
You mean as far as other railroad guys?
I don't know, as far as any interest, because obviously he was pinpointed. Someone was trying to...
Well, remember, the Kuhn Loeb, they owned more railroads. They didn't just back... Here's how it was. They didn't just back Harriman to get Union Pacific. They backed a lot of other railroad guys. And because essentially they held the paper, as you'd say, or they were the ones who gave the loans, they really controlled the railroad industry. And I would say that I don't know that the other railroads would be so much competition or rivals, because the way the railroads work is you have your own rail line. In the old days, that's the way it was. You built your rail line and you ran your trains, on yours. And I would say that maybe other railroad magnates that might have not been backed by the German bankers would be, your competitors. But I don't think Harriman had to worry about that too much, because he had, investments and so.
Yeah. Bankers are always invested in both sides of any conflict.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Kuhn Loeb did.
But I was thinking they were targeting Harriman for specific reasons, but probably then they just took those trains because they were following that line.
Right.
Or are you going into this in the book?
You've heard Harriman, Union Pacific and Harriman, they were involved in building some of the railroads in South America, so, they saw it as expansion. But, you've heard of, I guess it's Brown Harriman, the current company. I mean, this is, and in the 20th century, the Harriman brothers who, George Bush.
I was just going to ask you about that. They're connected to
Prescott Bush.
Yeah,
Prescott Bush and all that.
Yeah.
This is the same family. The two Harriman, these two were the sons of E.H. Harriman that was involved with Butch Cassidy. See, so this is how this all ties in. And, these Harriman would have been involved probably in the foundation of some aspect of this breakaway civilization group that split off from the German NYMZA. So you begin to see, when you follow these trails into the 20th century, how this connects. So,
indeed. And you had the Nazi connections to the blue blood Americans.
Exactly.
For those who don't know it, those people here, Harriman, Kuhn, Loeb, Bush, they're all part of the old money.
Yes.
They're all part of the 1%ers. It's about, according to sane researchers, it's about, I think it's 6,000 people, 300 families, basically at the top of the pyramid of today. So this is what they, in pulp conspiracy literature, would refer to as Illuminati.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, okay, this is so interesting. The time is running away. I have a couple of more questions if you can afford it.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. How advanced was technology connected to these? You did mention it, but you didn't elaborate on it. You described briefly how these ships were, and you also implied they had something to do with
the bell
technology. Yes. But
yes.
As we know, the bell technology was also had time disturbing aspects to them, and of course, when you're into gravity, it's unavoidable. So, what do you know of how advanced this was? How did it come off, and what did you read?
Well, based on what I know, let me try to give you an analogy that might put it in perspective. Okay, let's start with this. You've got the modern, what we'll call a modern UFO, right? Today's UFO that is the kind of UFO they've talked about since World War II, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Then you have the 1890s mystery airship version, okay, going back, and then go back further to the little smaller contraption 1850s version, right? Okay, now you've got these three versions. The early little small 1850s version UFO or aero thing, the 1890s larger, a little more advanced version, and then the post-World War II version, right? Okay, now look at it this way. Look at it in terms of automobiles. The 1850s version of this Bell technology anti-gravity little craft, that's like a Model T, a Ford Model T, just kind of a rickety old style early car. Okay. Then the 1890s version, that would be like, a 1955 Buick Roadmaster, or a 50s model Mercedes Benz. Okay.
Right.
Okay. And then today's or the post World War II era of UFO would be like a Ferrari race car.
Yeah.
So do you follow me there? So even though Bell technology goes into all of these, in the 1850s, the Sonora Aeroclub, they were dealing with the early Model T versions, which basically what it could do is lift up off the ground and propel forward, and it was just really just a basic, very rudimentary flying machines. And then you go, 35, 40 years later in the 1890s, and you've got the 1950s Buick Roadmaster or Mercedes-Benz, sedan version, of this Bell technology that still basically really all it does is fly, but it goes faster. It's a little sleeker. It's got a little bit more bells and whistles on it. But then you take that leap into the Ferrari Formula One race car, and that's a different animal than that 50s Mercedes or Buick, and a way different animal than the Model T. It's the automobile at its whatever, the highest, and that's what we're dealing with today in whatever this NYMZA group and these breakaway civilizations are flying. That's the Ferrari race car version of what we're talking about from the 19th century. Is that a good analogy?
Yeah, it is, and especially considering that Mr. Farrell has made a point of that when you can see the evolution of UFOs in a very short time span, it suggests something terrestrial rather than extraterrestrial.
I agree. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm convinced that extraterrestrials are out there. I think that's a no-brainer. And I'm convinced that they've been coming here since, there's been life on this planet. But I do agree with Joseph. I think, and after my background, I think that 90% of what people are reporting in the UFO world are very much there's of terrestrial origin. And yet it's coming from this fascinating, mysterious, secret background that we're talking about. So it's equally fascinating.
The Ford models, that made me think of the man Ford. He was very connected to Nazis.
Yes, he was.
He was a little later, but have you seen that family involved in any of this?
I haven't gone into the 20th century aspects of this. And in fact, the book I'm writing right now takes place right in the middle of the 19th century. And when it's out, I think you'll like it. Based on today's conversation,
for sure.
I think you'll like it a lot.
Me too. Wow. Well, it's very interesting. You certainly piqued my curiosity, and I do think this area needs a lot more research and investigation because it's such a blank spot on the map.
And here's the funny thing. There's a lot of guys who are really, really into the 20th century UFO thing, and you'll be amazed at what little, or in some cases nothing, do they know about this 19th century stuff. And actually, anybody who really looks at it, they come away realizing that it's essential. You cannot understand the 20th century UFO phenomenon unless you have a grasp on what happened in the 19th century.
Obviously, no. Really interesting stuff here. I think this is a blank zone on the map, and I'm glad someone is delving into this and trying to uncover this stuff. I suggest people who are interested and curious not only get your book, but since you're not an armchair researcher like so many else, people don't realize how expensive it is to research. So I suggest people that if you want us to get deeper into this stuff and keep Walter on the track, send a detective on this track here, you go to his website, his blog, Empire of the Wheel, blogspot.com, and you donate a few bucks so that we can keep you in business.
I appreciate that. Every little bit helps. That's for sure. Yeah. I'm so obsessed that I probably will do it anyway. But you're right. Every little bit helps.
Sure. Especially if you have to go to Europe or something. I'm convinced you'll find stuff there if you follow up on the original NYMZA group.
I agree. It's something that I'm still pursuing.
Excellent. We need to get you back in the future, Walt, because this stuff is really connected, that's for sure. And when I've got a better look at your books, I can give you better questions. But I hope this will suffice for people who want to check it out.
It was a great discussion. I really appreciate you having me on, and I look forward to being on again.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al.
So again, the book covering the research Walt shared with us is called Friends from Sonora and is the second volume to the Empire of the Wheels trilogy. Despite the poor sound quality, we hope you enjoyed today's forum with this fundamental preface to our entire ongoing Breakaway Civilization series. If so, feel free to contribute a few cents to help improve the listening quality. Drop in next time for an even more spectacular yet sober exploration of our fantastic reality. Until then, I sincerely remain your host Al, and from the rest of the team, be seeing you.
Who is number one?